Sourceball videocast here at The Independent. Sorry about the slight delay. I'm Kim Wingery, author and commentator. Today I'm joined by Peter Lewis, writer and media campaigner and advisor, author of the recently published Webtopia. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I really enjoyed your book and found myself not only nodding in agreement, but also feeling enlightened by many of the insights it offered into the digital world we live in. Tell us a bit what it is about and also a bit about what you learned from writing the book.
Well, it actually started off as an attempt to make sense of growing up as a Generation Xer. I think as a white, straight, middle-class male, Generation X is the one area where I feel that I'm a member of a minority group, and I've always looked at the world through a generational lens, maybe because it's the only, part of my life where I can actually feel a little bit like an outsider. And so I wanted to write a book about Generation X, growing up, coming of age, turning 50. I've just turned 50 a couple of years ago. And so I pitched this idea up to a publisher, and they kind of said, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but a little bit indulgent. And we unpacked it a little bit. And what really became clear as I started talking about my journey was the way that my life had been anchored by the technological change that is the internet. So, our grandparents' generation, the World War was their defining moment. For baby boomers, it was probably the counterculture movement. For us, it was this technological shift. And for me, it became an anchor point for my life. So as someone that grew up in the analog world, started my working life when computers were just coming online, I think I'm a member of a generation, will be the last generation to experience life without hyperconnectivity. And so I think we bring a certain perspective that people that have grown up as digital natives can never be expected to have. So, the book is really just a series of stories of people who I've met along the way, who have had their lives defined in different ways by this amazing technological shock. And I think the common theme that runs through it is that we thought this was going to transform our world and make it so much better. And we're now at a point where we're taking pause and wondering if the promise has actually been matched by the reality.
Yeah, I thought that was a particularly interesting aspect as I started reading your book, how it goes through, it starts in an unexpected place, really, about, I'm a bit older than you, but we kind of share a similar background. And I use an example with my mum, who, after I moved to Australia 30 years ago, until she passed away, we talked on the phone every fortnight or thereabouts. And she would invariably always end the conversation with saying, Kim, isn't the phone a marvelous invention? And that's just always how much change her generation went through, but then the explosive change that our generation has gone through. And now the generations following us, the pace just keeps picking up, doesn't it?
And it happens so fast and in such an all-consuming way that I think it catches up with you and you don't even understand the impacts while it's going on around you. I think the moment that it really shifted was when the phone and the internet converged into the one device. And then it wasn't just that you've got a mobile phone and you're accessible and you can talk to an individual. That whole, that you are part of a grid that you're moving in and out of and across. I've got a friend whose teenage son's just traveling the world, as we all, did at certain stages in our lives. And one of his reflections was that he's not really away because we're online with him every night and he's not actually finding the space to be away from his life. And our life has become the network. And I feel that the demarcations between the inner self and the public self are sort of friction away with it. So yes, the telephone was a great organising tool. You could connect over distance. The internet's something else altogether again, and I still think we're thinking through what those implications are.
Yeah, and you talk about that in your book about the unfilled promises of the web, but also about how the internet and the social media giants in particular are kind of taking control of our lives in ways that are not always desirable, as you just mentioned.
Well, the business model now is that we are offered access to these networks that appear to be free, but the price of entry is the tick box. And in the tick box, you're allowing these platforms to track you, collect information about everywhere you go. That is then collected and analysed to understand.
Are you back with us, Peter?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Sorry about that.
I don't know.
I think I was one of the many.
While you were offline, I was saying should be the one with these problems. I'm in Bali. That's supposedly a second world country when it comes to internet connectivity. But let's push on. You know, in your book, you left the best to last. The very last sentence, as a matter of fact, saying what comes next is up to us. And I really think that's so important. I write about democracy reform, which is an equally big and hairy subject, where reform seems elusive and difficult to achieve in the face of so much vested interest. But I do say the same, we can't give up and we need to do what we can as individuals. So what are some of the things you think we can do to manage our sort of the digital world dominance as we talked about before?
Yeah, you know, when I started thinking through the issue, one of the things that I find most distressing is this sense of inevitability about the path we're on. But if you unpack it, you know, the technological change is being driven by consumer markets, by government decisions, and ultimately by personal usage. So as citizens, as consumers, and as individuals, I think we've got a responsibility to have a consciousness of the change that's occurring around us, and from there other things flow. So I think there is a role for sensible regulation of the internet. I think that the idea that it is this this world without rules is not sustainable, and I don't think that there is even a World Wide Web anymore. I think we've got a Chinese model of the web, a Russian model of the web, an American hyper-capitalist model of the web. We've got an emerging European web. So what's an Australian web going to look like? I think it's on us to have those discussions and ask our leaders to take us. And it's been interesting, the new Morrison government on a couple of areas, they're showing a desire to be up for that discussion. As someone from the progressive side of politics, it's easy just to turn your back when your side loses, but I think there's really good work the government can do. And, you know, the ACCC inquiry is a first step, and we can talk about that in a moment. There's a whole bunch of other things there as well. I think particularly around the way technology is using our children as beta testing sites, and the way that educators have been totally seduced by the idea that connectivity will make people smarter, which I don't think bears up to scrutiny, and I think there's a bit of a wind back there going. So I think there's a place for regulation, which will only occur if we as citizens demand it. I think there's also a place for businesses to be more mindful of the way they use people's data, and we as consumers demand certain things from the businesses we use. I can see, if we get this right, that respect for personal information should be a fourth plank of corporate social responsibility. And then I think the third thing is for us as citizens and individuals to be mindful of both the benefits of connectivity but the downside. And just as we don't eat hamburgers and milkshakes every day, but we like to have a balanced diet and we like to exercise, we need to build a language around what is a healthy digital life and when are we turning off and for how long. And, you know, we can't really expect our kids to be doing it for themselves if we can't do it. So I think there's a whole lot of really important questions we need to be asking ourselves at this moment in history, because I feel that we've crossed a tipping point where that sense that just continuing the rollout of this amazing technology was going to lead to self-evident benefits no longer bears up to critical analysis. I call it the 4 Ds. Distraction, we can't concentrate anymore. Denial, we can't agree on basic truths. Division, it's actually pulling us further apart, bringing us closer together. And displacement, we're well on the track to replacing the need for us as workers, and, you know, ultimately we just become little consumers that are clicking things to build up the base of the big data overlords. So that's a fairly dark place to end up, and I don't end the book in that place. What I try to say is that's where we're headed, but we can do things about that if we do act as citizens.
Yeah, and I think that's a good summary of it too. The ACCC report, of course, focuses a lot on Google and Facebook, both in terms of their share of the advertising dollar, but also in news dissemination and distribution. So I'm sure you've had a chance to read it, or at least the summary. What are your thoughts on some of the recommendations?
Well, without blowing smoke in your direction, Kim, I kind of agree with you that this is not about creating a whole new set of laws, but applying the laws that existed to the media to the new platforms. And it got me thinking that the media is just an industry that's been disrupted, and I call it in the book by the notion of terra nullius. We come in with a new model and we say your laws no longer apply to us because, we're not a taxi service, we're a ride-sharing service where you pay us to drive you from A to B. Let's think about this in terms of the impact of the digital platforms on the media model, and it's not dissimilar. It's a different delivery mechanism, sure, but the output's pretty similar. So I thought the ACCC sends us some really interesting questions. I'm really curious to see how the government responds. I think there'll be a massive pushback from the big digital platforms. If I've got a critique, it's not really a critique of the ACCC. It's actually the analysis is done through the framework of us as consumers rather than as citizens. And you can see in part of that report, the authors are actually going outside their brief and they're looking at somebody as a consumer more broadly than just being somebody in a market transaction. And I think that's because there is an acceptance that the media is more than simply another widget and it's got a broader social purpose. And we're starting to see the implications of the breakdown of that social purpose. But I would like to hope that the government doesn't cherry pick on the recommendations. I suspect that if you're going to do this, you've got to look at it in its entirety. So I can sort of see a world where they're going to fiddle around the edges and say, we're not going to fund the ABC anymore because we're liberals, we're not going to do that. It'd be really interesting to see if the whole thing survives as a package. But it's only just the first step. That does not solve the internet. That actually is a case study in whether a particular industry can be regulated from the negative benefits of this amazing technology.
Yeah, I think that's true. And my disappointment is really that, as a lot of these things do, including the Banking Royal Commission report too, was they tend to too quickly hone in on actions because that's kind of what they're told to do, and they so often lack the big picture. And I think that's a biggest criticism I have with this report too. It lacks an understanding of the big picture. It presents a number of recommendations around better governance, complaints handling, stronger privacy regulation, better funding for public broadcasters, and media awareness training. That's all well and it's just not enough, is it?
No, you feel, I wonder if they've read Shoshana Zuboff side by side. I was trying to read the two books in parallel, or that and the report from the ACCC. And, broader analysis of the whole model of a technological industry that's based on the extraction and exploitation of people's personal information is the missing part in, but they touch on it by talking about the advertising algorithms. But yeah, I don't think it's quite there.
And you the sort of trying to regulations, but then he kind of stops at that. So it doesn't go on to say, which I've said for years, is recognize that YouTube is not at all that different to broadcast TV. Podcasts are just unscheduled radio. Online news is just news without ink. We try and complicate things without kind of first looking at existing regulation and see how that fits. And if it doesn't, then we expand it. Don't just run out and do new regulation just for the sake of it. For the sake of it, I think we do that a lot.
I think that's
right. When it comes to YouTube and Facebook, why not consider licensing video distribution as we do TV?
Yeah, I know that was an idea, that the licensing model, looking at these platforms more like utilities than broadcasters. Look, I've got some sympathy with Paul Fletcher's response that it's not reasonable to say these platforms are merely an extension. They are something different, but there are similarity. But the product is of a type that the public policy priorities that drove the construction of the traditional media market, which wasn't just a business model, it was a public good, also needs to be applied to these digital platforms. You know, for instance, as someone that does a lot of political campaigning, I've got to prove the facts of any TV ad I put on air during a federal election period. There are no similar rules to put persuasive material up on Facebook and other platforms. And that's, you know, that just doesn't make sense. And, you know, Facebook says, oh, we don't have the resources to do this, but, you know, they're pretty quick at pulling down anything that sort of doesn't meet their, you know, their community standards. And it's sort of, you know, I think we're at the point where we're accepting violence, and there are some things that are not okay, and then the default is everything else is. And so maybe the defining line is going to become, well, what else is not okay? And fake news isn't okay because it is a cancer in our democracy. So, you know, I think good. I was surprised at how detailed and B, accessible the ACCC report was. There was an effort to actually start a public conversation with that document. It wasn't just technocrats talking in jargon. There was actually an attempt to talk outwards. So, you know, good on them. I thought the initial response from the Treasurer and the Communications Minister was, these are important issues. We are going to have a discussion about them, was the entirely appropriate way to respond. Good on them. What comes next now is the next 6 months. What does the community consultation look like? Is it merely going to be the digital platforms mobilising to minimise or block the change, or is there going to be a real discussion within the broader community that gives the government the momentum to actually do something meaningful in this space? And yes, I'm with you. It's not all of it, but gee, you know, if we could just get government to have the spine to start thinking about appropriate regulation, and B, prove to them that there's a political upside in going down that path, like that's a lot better than where we are today.
Yeah, I think there is actually a different path to take too. I've been, as I'm sure you have, watching from afar the massive fines that EU has put on Google over the last, 4 or 5 years. I think at the moment it's added up to some $15 billion in total fines. Facebook was recently slapped with $5 billion in fines. It's, these companies can pay $5 billion, without blinking. So I don't think that actually is all that effective. And I'm hoping we don't just go down that path of kind of a big stick, that instead we look at real regulation, we look at demands upon them, upon the social media and search giants that actually mean something and mean some change. And of course they'll fight it. But Australia, I think, is big enough and important enough in that world that we actually can lead the way here rather than just follow, as we tend to do.
Yeah, and I think there is a global context in this. There is meaningful changes going on in Europe through the GDPR. And, I don't know, I can't, I wouldn't even try to predict how the Democratic primaries are going to roll out. But if Elizabeth Warren is still in the top 3, in 6 months' time, there's going to be a really live debate about whether Facebook should be broken up. So these things are, like, I feel that we're at this point where there is a broad acceptance that something must be done. And then is it going to be minimalist or significant? Is it going to be incremental? Or will we have a moment, as we did in the 1820s when we started seeing the implications of the Industrial Revolution, sending kids down coal mines and into factories, and out of that became the Factories Act, became occupational health and safety law, rise of trade unions, rise of mutuals. So, I think we're at that moment, and with the right energy and, I don't know, will of political commitment. I see Denise sort of commenting there, she doesn't have the faith in government, and why would you? But government is kind of only as good and only as responsible as the people. And there are areas that are really significant retail politics here. And I don't necessarily think that's the future of the media, but I think the strong retail politics is threefold. One, it's what is being done with our personal information. Two, it is what happened to our jobs. And three, most significantly, what is being done with our kids. They are being exposed to untested apps and games and platforms that are constructed on the basis of gambling principles, and it's a wild west out there, and we're watching in real time that impact. That seems to me a conservative political agenda to protect kids, and if we can engage the conservative side of politics on ideas like that, then you've got a beachhead to sort of start saying, yep, this technology is amazing, but it needs to have some ring fencing around it. And the idea that libertarianism is going to lead us into the future just doesn't bear any sort of scrutiny anymore.
Yeah. I think that that tugs at the heartstrings for all of us, regardless of our political leanings and our beliefs in government, doesn't it? You do talk about the contract, which we have all done with the digital giants. Give us this wonderful stuff for free, and we'll use your data. And of course, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and all the others, they'll fight this tooth and nail. But to me, that is actually part of what has to happen, and including one thing that nobody is really talking about, but which will be difficult to do, but is doable, is to create a firewall for one of the identifiable data away from the metadata. I think that's a must-do step in the right direction. It doesn't solve all the issues, but to quite simply say, no, you can't use any identifiable data. It's not yours to use. And that has to happen through regulation.
We don't even have a language at the moment around what is okay and what is not okay. We tick a box and we don't even think about it. That's the price of entry. We go to a website and allow cookies. We've got no idea what that means. So it's sequencing it out, isn't it? Let's have a conversation about what's okay and what's not okay. Then let's support businesses that do what's okay, what's not okay. Then let's buy products, and it rolls out from there. You know what I'm saying? Like I think we need a language around this before we can have any sort of sense of public change in it. At the moment, we've entered this Faustian pact and we didn't really know what we were signing up for. Maybe one of the actions will be that there is an amnesty on the click box and people can check out. We've got in Europe this whole right to be forgotten. Like, I think that's really important as well. Yeah. So I'm still learning every day how this stuff works. I'm no expert in this field. I'm a citizen that's just stumbled across it because I want to write a book about turning 50. But, it's all consuming. It's all consuming, and I'm really motivated to keep this conversation going.
Just quickly back on the European EU regulations on privacy. Is there anything else you've seen overseas that we could possibly adopt and use also here in Australia without having to reinvent the wheel?
I think, if you break it down, there's the personal data piece. I don't see anywhere that's really coming to terms with this notion that there should be regulation of the way kids are getting access to the web. I think in our own backyard, there's interesting models of schools going offline, which is counterintuitive for anyone that thought the internet was going to make us all smarter. But, there's not a whole lot of shining lights out there at the moment. I just think there's a lot of there's a lot of red flags there. We can see what's going on in China with the use of the combination of facial recognition, AI, and a state control just is a dystopia. But likewise, the wild west of America now, where everyone lives in an angry echo chamber, isn't a whole lot better. So I think starting from the basics, what sort of country do we want to be? What are the values? Again, back to the Industrial Revolution. Out of the changes, Australia was one of the first nations to adopt a whole bunch of principles that were based around giving everybody a stake in the economy. How will that work? There's interesting debates going on around ownership of your personal data, and whether down the track that's something that, if we're all out of a job, we can at least monetize the value that our personal data is bringing in the algorithms. So that's kind of an idea that's floating around. But no one's worked this through fully. There are a number of foundations now looking at, there's the Centre for Humane Technology in the States. There's some similar bodies in Europe. I'm really interested in seeing if we can set something up similar in Australia. And so one of my little side projects at the moment, scoop for the crowds watching this podcast, is to set up a Centre for Responsible Technology in Australia that might be an advocate on these issues.
Oh, okay. All right. That sounds very interesting.
We'll break it on independence.org.au and when it's time.
Yeah, okay. I really like your parallel that you just mentioned, and also book evolution. So, and it almost brings me to say, maybe we need another eureka moment here, but digital eureka moment.
It won't be the peasants uprising. It'll be the people turning off Facebook, and this could be solved if everyone walked away from the platforms that are doing them damage. But the process of building the consciousness to get to that point and having an alternative. Like, who said the public square should be a privately owned space? Who said that? And there are alternatives. It's just they haven't been imagined yet or built yet. And, I don't think it's a government, but an independent agency, a for-purpose mutual that runs a social platform that doesn't collect data and do bad shit and just lets us share our photos and our ideas amongst people that we want to. Like, I don't understand why it needs to be a private enterprise, but that's what we're working with at the moment.
It certainly is. And I'd like to close on this. There's so much to talk about, but we are running out of time. But I just want to go back quickly to my favorite part of your book. It is up to us. And in that kind of, to me, also embodies a bit of optimism. So what are some of the things that we can do, and maybe some of the things you think we must do, just as individuals?
Well, as an individual, I think it's be conscious of our own digital life and the choices we make. First, as individuals, as I said, let's start thinking about what a healthy digital life looks like. I love Twitter. I love podcasts. I love scanning the news and whatever, but I also, writing this book has forced me to reappreciate how much I love when I've got nothing in my ears or in my pocket and leaving it at home and taking the dog for a walk and having my own clear thoughts. So healthy digital lives, building into being responsible as consumers and demanding to know a little bit more about both the companies we use, the organisations we join, and the platforms we're on. And then finally, as citizens, building a language around the politics of the Australian web and what that could look like and how that could deal with some of the, the burning platforms that we're witnessing at the moment.
Yeah. Very true. Well, thank you so much, Peter. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thanks to everyone listening. For more on Peter's book, go to his website, webtopiabook.com, where you can obviously also buy the book.
I'm planning to get a discussion
going
there too, but I haven't quite got there yet. So that's
okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This video will be up on our YouTube channel soon and published on the independence.org.au, along with our daily feeds of independent media stories and podcasts. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter.
Good on you, Kim. Cheers.